The days are dwindling down to a precious few. That is the days of 2019. And here to discuss the year that is passing with us is Professor Richard Wolff, who we always enjoy speaking with. Richard Wolff is, of course, an economist. He is the founder of Democracy at Work, which can be found at democracyatwork.info. He is a professor at the New School. He is also the author of a new book on socialism, and he is the host of Economic Update on Free Speech TV. So first of all, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Richard. I'm glad to be here.
So we're getting into the holidays, and which means we're getting into the end of the year, and we're going to see a lot of stories about what the big story was, but I have a feeling that somehow they may miss some of the underlying things that are going on economically, socially, and so on. So without holding you to it in any way, what are a couple thoughts from your end? I have a couple thoughts too on what we might call the big underreported stories of the year were.
Well, I've been thinking about it myself for the same reasons you have. And let me offer a couple. I think on one level, perhaps the most important economic story, which is the kind of story I'm particularly sensitive to, has been the mounting of a multi-front war, economic war against the People's Republic of China. Whether you look at asking Canada to arrest a leading executive of the Huawei Corporation, or the recent decision of the government to stop using Chinese machinery, asking international agencies to stop lending money to China, or the imposing of tariffs, the single biggest thing. We have an across-the-board effort to attack and economically hurt and damage another country. That's extraordinary. It's extraordinary in American history on a scale like this. In peacetime, when there is no claim that there is a war or an imminent war or a risk of war, it's extraordinary economic warfare, number one. Number two, it's extraordinary because it is being perpetrated by a Republican president, in which we see a Republican, normally part of a party that says the government should not interfere in economic activities. It should not pick winners and losers among corporations. It should not levy taxes. Let's remember that the tariff is a tax. It's a kind of tax. Mr. Trump, with Republican support, has imposed enormous taxes, which is remarkable for a party that is, quote unquote, anti-tax. I could go on. But I think that is a remarkable story for the following reason. It represents a shift from the belief that we are part of a world economy, we in the United States, and that this world economy is interconnected and interdependent, and that the well-being of one part of it requires an accommodation with other parts of it, a peaceful accommodation built around the flows of capital and labor and goods and services. That is all being brushed aside, even though it has been the policies of both Republican and Democratic governments for decades. It is being replaced by gross protectionism. The rest of the world be damned, as Mr. Trump says over and over again. Everybody's out to cheat us, not the mentality of an international regime, if you like. And we're going to punish, and we're going to hurt, and we're going to squeeze, and we're going to rewrite agreements to help us against them. And the them are not just China, but it is Europe, Latin America, anybody who doesn't knuckle under, it's just a very different idea. And my last point on this is the following. Is it possible that this is just a temporary change of pace, attributable to a very unusual, I'm being polite here, a president, Mr. Trump, or maybe even an unusual president with an unusual political party tilting to the right in the Republicans? That's one theory. And so it'll go away once Mr. Trump and the Republicans are voted out, if and when that happens. But there is an alternative argument, which is just as strong, that most of these activities have not been particularly well challenged by the Democratic Party either. Mm-hmm. It has focused itself on impeachment. It has focused itself on issues like Russian interference in an election. It has carefully avoided any kind of counter politics around the economic war on China and around the shift to protectionism. So it is possible, and the rest of the world is going through this process, that we are not seeing a temporary aberration in Mr. Trump and the Republicans, but rather we're seeing a declining American capitalism deciding that what it was before during its ascendancy, namely a leader in international cooperation, at least among capitalist countries, is reverting to a much more defensive position associated with countries that are in threat of damage from the rest of the world economy, and deciding to go it alone, where the chips can fall, Lord knows well. The history of our human race is full of trade wars ending up as military wars, trade competitions ending up as military wars. One of the reasons we had the League of Nations and then the United Nations was because the horrific World Wars I and II emerged from competition among contending capitalist countries, and the United States seems determined to go backwards into that universe, and the Democrats not making more of an opposition forces everybody, even our allies in France or Britain or Italy and so on, to think to themselves, the United States is becoming a rogue nation and has to be dealt with in a radically different way that make all the old alliances, NATO included, obsolete as a part of the world, very strong still, even if declining, flails out in its decline and threatens, to be blunt about it, to take everyone down with it. For me, that's the big story of the 2019 year.
Well, I have some questions about that story, Richard Wolff, and one of them is this. It seems to me there are a lot of contradictions around this story, but a lot of them have to do with the Democrats. For example, I remember well that during the Obama years, the Clinton years, the Democrats presented themselves as the party of quote-unquote international trade, global finance, aggressively pushed for new trade deals, WTO and NAFTA under Bill Clinton, additional deals under the Obama administration, including aggressively pushing for the TPP. So the Democrats, at least the Democratic establishment stance during those years, especially when people would come from the labor side and point out that labor leaders were being murdered in countries that we were negotiating or had trade deals with, or the Obama administration overlooking child slave labor in, I believe it was Malaysia, in order to continue enforcing a trade agreement there. Whatever the implications, good or bad, the Democratic leadership portrayed itself as the party of kind of global trade and finance under the current economic world order? Have they just thrown up their hands and walked away? Do they not have a coherent position around this, or is there some sort of shift that you see in their approach as well?
No, I think they have been, there used to be this theory called, or this concept called regulatory capture. And what that meant was that industries that were supposed to be regulated by one or another government agency were able politically and with donations to capture that agency, to become dominant in the agency, thereby nullifying any real regulation of themselves. I think what's happened to the Democrats is something similar. They've been captured by the very forces they thought they were regulators of. They've been captured by the big banks. They've been captured by the big corporations. They've become dependent on their donations as campaigning for office has become very expensive in the era of television, et cetera, et cetera. And so we see a Democratic Party that gives lip service to things, but is basically in the pocket of the same kinds of corporations that also control the Republican Party, leading to the sardonic, but nonetheless basically true, that in the United States, we don't have two parties, we have two wings of one party, the Republican and the Democrat, who are both pro-capitalist, pro-business, and the only difference is the Democrats need the labor working people's votes, so they give lip service, they give some formality to it. But I think it goes further. I don't think it's just the Democratic Party, but I think the labor movement itself has been co-opted in this way, captured, if you like, in this way. They reacted to the international movement of capital by wanting protection. They wanted protection from losing jobs. They wanted protection in the way that Mr. Trump promised to give them. I'll bring the jobs back here. Now, yes, it was true. Mr. Trump was talking loosely. He can't really do it. He hasn't, in fact, done it in any meaningful way through over 3 years of his first term, and there's little prospect he will do it in the future either, partly because he can't. But it means that a good number of labor union members voted for Trump, may well do it again, because they don't see the Democrats as being able or willing to help them in their 30-year decline. I mean, let me be real blunt here. Over the last 30 to 40 years, productivity, the output per worker in this country, has continued to rise 1 or 2 or 3% a year. Over the same period of time, the real wages, that is what a worker gets adjusted for what he or she can afford to buy with it, has been stagnant. That's why we have inequality. Working people's income is frozen, and the income of the rich, the profit that comes from the gap between what the worker gives the employer, productivity, and what the employer gives the worker, wages and salaries, explains our grotesquely inequality society. But the business community, which is happy, sees a labor movement that is bitter about this, but doesn't know where to go with that bitterness, because the Democratic Party, to which it looks for leadership, has nothing to say about all of this, is supportive of the business community, is eager to let it go around the world, is eager to let it bring in immigrants at low wages, is eager to facilitate the automation that makes workers redundant. And all of those hurtful things could be answered with all kinds of policies, but the Democratic Party is unwilling to go there because it could hurt or offend the business community upon which they have come to depend. So the labor movement, let me just give you 2 examples. In France, starting last week, we have a general strike. All the unions, there was only one that didn't join, and it joined yesterday, are against Mr. Macron's government, against any cut in the pension system in that country. And millions of people are in the streets of 250 cities across France. Look at that. That is a massive public outpouring. We've had a year of yellow vest movements towards the same end. Compare that to the United States, where the AFL-CIO has not called a single demonstration against Mr. Trump, can't mobilize or won't mobilize people even though there's assault after assault. The tax cut in December of 2017 was a massive gift to the richest people in America and to the biggest corporations. And it has been used to justify cutting back food stamps for the poorest. I mean, the grotesquerie of this is stunning. But even more stunning is the absence of opposition. I think you're seeing a kind of a deer in the headlights shock of the American people at what the business community, now led by Trump, is imposing on them. And it's a kind of frozen moment in American history.
And again, we're talking with Professor Richard Wolff. But there's an aspect of this, too, that I think is not clear to a lot of people, which is I think that a lot of working people around this country would say, hey, trade barriers against China, great, because maybe that'll mean some of the manufacturing jobs will come back home. And as the opposite of that, many people would think, well, global capital wants this flow of income, of labor, and so on. Apple builds many of its products, the iPhone and so on, in China with cheap labor, sometimes under unsafe conditions and so on. Don't the big corporations want open trade with China? So I guess there's a way of looking at this that I think understandably confuses people, where they say, well, maybe this will bring jobs back to the United States, and what's wrong with throwing up walls against deals with China anyway?
Well, let me answer that in the same way that we would teach a course in economics. And when I say we would teach the course, here I mean not just leftists like me, but my colleagues on the right wing and my colleagues in the middle, because we all teach this material in the same way. If you erect a barrier, a tariff in the way that Trump has, or some quota of how many goods from abroad can come in, what you're doing is raising the price. Let me give you a very simple example. You bring in an iPhone made in China, and you can charge $285 for it because it's cheap to make in China, which is why Apple went there. If the government hits a tariff trying to get Apple to come back into the United States, for example, to produce the phone, let's suppose it's successful. Apple will come back, but it will have to pay US wages instead of Chinese wages. And to do that, if they're going to have any profit at all, they will raise the price of the Apple phone. There is no option here. So what you're going to do, if you're successful, is raise the level of prices across the board in all those industries that have gone to China or India or Brazil or any of the other places that Mr. Trump is protecting us from. The end result will be one of two things, both of which are bad for working people. Number one, prices will go up, but employers won't raise wages. That will be a direct blow to the already stressed standard of living of American workers. You have to think about that. You can't pretend it isn't going to happen. Here's the second option. The wages will go up because workers will demand it so they can afford the now higher prices of the protected American market. Then corporations, having to pay those higher wages, guess what? They'll raise the prices again, and we will have a real ducky inflation in this country, which will also wipe out large portions of the standard of living. So you can talk all you want about bringing the jobs back, but you're not being honest to the people of the United States because you're not telling them what the results will actually be. And this is not a fancy argument. This is proven by 400 years of history of this kind of thing. And I can tell you from my soul, knowing I live here in New York City, I meet with bankers and executives all the time. They're acutely aware of this. They want to be able to bring cheap consumer goods from China, not because they care about those goods or even the businesses involved. They don't want pressure from below from workers who will demand higher wages if the prices of what they have to buy go up because we're not bringing in the cheap stuff from abroad. That's what it means to have an international economy. And what you're seeing is a Trump GOP cashing in on the bitter suffering of the last 30 or 40 years of the American working class, which is genuine, responding to it by selling them fakery, the idea that we can fix all that ails them, their indebtedness they can't carry, the inability to pay for their kids' education, the inability to provide the American dream they were told was their entitlement. That bitterness is being sold a bill of goods to get Mr. Trump into the presidency and to keep him there with the Republican Party tailing along. In its rush to control that, it is sacrificing the economic future of the United States. And the interesting thing about that is that's how every empire collapses. When the people in charge lose their sense of how to work in the world, become focused on their own accumulation, and in the process, tear the whole thing down.
So why aren't the big corporations who have so much influence in our political process saying, A, we like the way things work now because we like building our products in China on the cheap and then selling them here? And why aren't they stepping up and preventing this? Why aren't they instructing, and if not Trump, compliant Republicans and Democrats to oppose this? Why has there been virtually no debate about it?
Well, I think behind the scenes, there's plenty of debate. Even today, Jamie Dimon and Morgan Stanley is beginning to raise the question, which he has done privately, that all of this China warfare is dangerous and should be reined in. I think you may see in the next few days, in fact, this fakery about a temporary or interim agreement with China, in which the United States basically takes a step back because of the pressure of big business and pretends to have an interim agreement, lots of really bullshit, if you pardon my Spanish, parallel to the make-believe that the new treaty version of NAFTA is in some significant way different from the old one, which it is not. You'll see all of that because that's an accommodation. Mr. Trump is at risk of turning the entire international dependent American business community against him, and this is very dangerous for the Republican Party. I think you haven't seen more because most of the big businesses have been so mesmerized by the gift they got from Mr. Trump in the tax cut of December 2017 that they've been willing to look the other way because they're short-sighted and the extra billions they got that way is so delicious and they never expected to get it. I think the second thing that you got going for you is a fear that Mr. Trump and the Republicans have a solid third of the American people in their pocket. And the business community, remember, the big capitalists are a small minority. They have always counted on the alliance of evangelicals, of social conservatives, to be the only mass base they really have. And they don't want to frustrate those people because then the only mass organization will be the unions and the progressives, and that scares them too. So they're walking that kind of line, maybe a little dose of Trump and Republicans for 4 years is not too big a price to pay to get that tax cut, and then we'll get back to normal. I think that's probably how they see it.
Well, makes sense. And Richard Wolff, before I let you go, I do want to spend a couple minutes talking about what I'm picking, at least at the moment, as the top story of 2019, because I really like your thoughts on it. And it's this. I think the top story is the Democrats' Medicare for All debate. Obviously, it's got gotten a lot of coverage, so I can't exactly say it's not been reported. I can say it has not been reported the right way, or at least the way I see it, which is we've heard a lot of back and forth within the Democratic Party about whether or not it costs too much, even though multiple studies show that the overall cost of a Medicare for All or a single-payer healthcare system would be less than what we're paying today. So what I consider the biggest story is not just the Medicare for All debate, but how it is, I think, a proxy for the public versus the private economy in the United States. If you will, you could call it socialism versus capitalism. You could call it what you want. But basically, we're not talking, no matter how much the news media misreported or politicians misstated, my belief, we're not talking about quote unquote spending more money. We're talking about spending less, but we are talking about transferring a significant chunk of the US economy from private into public hands. And even though the outcome might be less spending, certainly would be much better health care, better life experience for most Americans, a vast majority of Americans. I think we've got a debate that is going to, at some point, blossom into a debate about what kind of economy and what kind of government and what kind of society we want to have. But I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
I agree with you. I think it's very, very important. And again, I think it goes to what we were just talking about. The Democrats had to go with this crazy debate over cost. The Republicans, they always do that every time there's a social program advanced by anybody, even a little bit progressive. All they can think of is to scare people into thinking it will cost them more money. That way, by keeping the debate on that subject, the Democrats avoid having to say the real point, which is many things in our society would be cheaper for us if they were organized collectively and run by the government, which doesn't need to make a profit, versus private enterprises, which have to jack up the price of what they do, because in addition to covering the cost, they have to cover the profit motive that's involved. And it's acute with medical, because the medical industrial complex is 4 industries in this country that work together: the doctors, the hospitals, the drug and device makers, and finally, the medical insurers. Those 4 industries work together. They're just like the military industrial complex. This is the medical industrial complex. And they have managed a system in which we pay more for medical care, adding all these costs together, than any other advanced country, and no other country is even close. Our medical outcomes are mediocre, but the cost is enormous. And so it's easy for the government to come in and say, we will do all of these activities, the insurance, the production, the hospitalization, the medical care. We can do it for no profit and for sure without charging monopoly prices, because we're not going to operate it as a monopoly. It's easy to show that the cost will be the same or less, almost certainly less, and it's also much fairer. So that would be the argument, but the big business community doesn't want that, because the argument not only applies to medical care, it applies to many other things, and the other industries don't want to hear anything about it. That's why they're willing to tolerate the monopoly of the medical in order to not have the question about private versus public become a real part of the American political discourse. And the Democrats, to their everlasting shame, have gone along with that. They can't bring themselves to teach the American people of the value and the virtues of doing things in a collective, egalitarian way. The irony is most Americans would get it. I live in New York City. We have a beautiful park in the middle of this city called Central Park. You don't pay anything to go into that park. You never have. You want to have a picnic with your family, you do it. The family next to you can be poor. The family on the other side of you can be rich. The idea is we're all citizens of this city. We all get together. It's something we have in common. And by making it a collective activity, it's much cheaper to produce and maintain a lovely park than it would be if it were privately run and the people who run it had to earn a profit. So the lessons of this, and public schools are the same thing, and on, they're all around us. You could teach the American people in a very short time. The Democratic Party could do it. The Democratic Party should do it. But as long as it's in the pocket of big business, it can't and it won't. And that leaves the field to allow the Republicans to do their scare campaign about it costing more money. And the Democrats have to make arguments with statistics that no one has the time or interest to pursue.
And then the other argument besides money is choice. You know, to use your analogy, you could pave over Central Park tomorrow, privatize the parking the park system in New York City, and then say, well, but you have choice. You can go to Park Company A or Park Company B or Park Company C. Now, the fact that none of them has a decent park would get obscured in the debate. The only way to have Central Park in New York City is for the city to own it. But that, to me, is exactly the piece that people, I mean, obviously Bernie's trying to make it, to a certain extent Elizabeth Warren is trying to make it, but by and large, within the Democratic Party, the presidential candidates and others are saying, no, you can't have this, you can't have Central Park, you wouldn't have choice of whatever little crummy pocket park somebody might, you know, take over and try to peddle to you. It's impossible, can't be done, and of course you have the media, the major media going along with that and amplifying the, oh, would you abolish private insurance and all of that, which you wouldn't need. So that to me too is the ideology of capitalism, right? Because that's, well, choice and markets solve everything, even if in the end the only choice that matters when it comes to your health is your choice of doctor and hospital.
Well, you know, fundamentalism comes in many forms, not just in religion. The fundamentalists in economics are the ones that preach that. There is only one God, and that God is private enterprise and markets. And everything else is in some way devilish. It's childish, it's lopsided, it's one-sided, it's narrow, but there's a certain appeal for certain folks in this kind of absolutist thinking, and so they reason that way. But I have two bases of optimism. You can't forever close out the rest of the world. 3 weeks ago, I was in Paris, France. I spent a week or two there. They have much more in the way of parkland, much more beautifully maintained. All parks are public. All parks are open to everybody. A week is more than you need to understand the power and the magnificence of a committed public park system, and it's been that way in France for centuries. You can't keep this information. By the way, it's true in all the other European countries as well. You can't keep it forever from the American people. You can keep it for a long time, but not forever. And my second reason for optimism is that the gap between this fundamentalist capitalist ideology on the one hand and the lived reality of the American working class, the gap between them is getting wider every day. The reality is that this quote unquote free enterprise market system is what's making more and more Americans unable to give one another the American dream. Parents can't give it to their kids. They can't get their kids into college without loading up on a level of debt that is unsustainable. Those realities, and those coming down the pike when the next economic downturn hits, as we all know it will, those realities are going to undercut the dominant fundamentalist ideology, because the clash between that and what is happening to people is unbridgeable within the realm of that ideology. And that's the basis of my optimism, that we're watching the decline of a system which will take with it the decline of the ideology that has justified that system.
Well, without sounding too fundamentalist, from your lips to God's ears, as they used to say. But, okay, well, 2020 is going to be a fascinating year, as they all are nowadays. And as always, Professor Richard Wolff, thanks so much for your insights, and thanks for coming on the program.
My pleasure, and thank you, Richard, for maintaining a program willing to talk about these issues. It's very, very important.